Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments, and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. It all began on one of those afternoons when everything feels slightly off balance, when the air is too still, and the clock seems to tick louder than usual. I was sitting in my small office cubicle, finishing reports that no one but my boss, Mr. Dalton, ever seemed to read. He was the kind of man who carried his presence like a quiet storm, not loud, not overbearing, but impossible to ignore. Around 3 o'clock, I heard his deep, familiar voice call my name from across the hall. "Martha, could you step into my office for a moment?" My heart always jumped a little when he said that. Not out of fear, but because he had this steady way of looking at you that made you feel seen. Really seen. I gathered my notepad and walked in. His office smelled faintly of cedar and old books, and sunlight filtered through the half-closed blinds, tracing warm stripes across his desk. He looked up from a drawer he had been rummaging through. "I've misplaced something important," he said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "A small silver pen. It's a gift from my late wife, and I had it here this morning. I can't seem to find it anywhere." The air in the room softened. His voice, usually so composed, carried a quiet ache. I could tell this wasn't about the pen, not really. It was about what it represented. I nodded gently. "I'll help you find it." He gave me a grateful smile, small, tired, but genuine. "You've always been the one I can count on, Martha." So I spent the next 2 hours searching through drawers, under stacks of papers, even in the break room where he sometimes went to refill his coffee. I asked around discreetly, but no one had seen it. The office emptied slowly as the evening shadows grew long, and the hum of the air conditioner became the only sound left. Finally, when I almost gave up, I noticed something glinting near the baseboard behind the filing cabinet. I knelt down, brushing away a thin layer of dust, and there it was, the silver pen, slightly tarnished, but unmistakable. I smiled to myself, feeling an unexpected rush of relief, as if I'd just returned a piece of his heart. I walked back to his office. The lights were dimmed, and he was sitting by the window, lost in thought. When I placed the pen on his desk, he looked up, startled at first, then almost emotional. He picked it up delicately, as though it might vanish again. "You found it," he said softly. "You really found it?" I nodded. "Behind the filing cabinet. Must have rolled off earlier." For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stared at the pen, then looked at me with that same steady gaze. "You have no idea what this means to me," he said. Something about that moment lingered. 2 people standing in the half-light of an empty office, surrounded by silence that felt heavy but safe. I don't know what made me say it, but I did. "You shouldn't be here alone tonight. Let me make you dinner." He blinked, clearly surprised, then gave a quiet chuckle. "Dinner? You'd do that?" "Consider it a thank you for trusting me with something important," I replied, trying to keep my tone light, though inside, my heart fluttered in a way it hadn't for years. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "All right. But only if you let me bring the wine." We agreed to meet at my place later that evening. As I packed up my things, I felt an unfamiliar mix of excitement and nerves. It wasn't a date, not really. But it felt like more than just dinner, too. Maybe it was the idea of being seen again, of sharing a quiet evening with someone who carried his own share of solitude. When I got home, I lit a few candles, nothing fancy, just enough to make the room feel warm. The kitchen smelled of roasted vegetables and herbs, and I could hear the faint ticking of the old wall clock I'd stopped noticing years ago. I caught myself smiling at the thought of him sitting at my table. When the doorbell rang, my heart skipped a beat. He stood there with a bottle of red wine and a shy, almost boyish smile. "I hope this pairs well with whatever you're cooking," he said. "It'll be perfect." I told him yes. He stepped inside. The evening took on a softness I hadn't felt in a long time, like the world outside had slowed down, just for us. We talked over dinner about everything and nothing, how he used to take his wife on long drives along the coast, how I missed painting and never found the time for it anymore. There was laughter, but also silence, the kind that didn't need to be filled. At one point, he reached for the wine bottle, refilled my glass, and said quietly, "It's strange, isn't it? How something small, like a lost pen, can bring back so much." I nodded. Sometimes life reminds us that what's lost can still be found if someone cares enough to look. He looked at me then, not as a boss, not as a colleague, but as someone who understood. The candles flickered, casting long shadows across the table. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible that night. As he left, he paused at the door and said, "Thank you, Martha, for finding more than just a pen tonight." When the door closed, I stood there for a long while, feeling the warmth of that sentence settle in my chest. I didn't know what it meant yet, or where it might lead, but something had shifted, quietly and deeply, like a door opening somewhere inside me that I hadn't realized was locked, and that's how it began, with a simple act of kindness, and an evening that neither of us could quite explain. The memory of that evening stayed with me in a way I hadn't expected. The next morning, the office felt different, not just the fluorescent lights or the hum of computers, but the air between Mr. Dalton and me seemed lighter, almost conspiratorial. There was a warmth in his greetings, a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Work carried on as usual, yet I noticed little things. The way he paused by my desk more often, as if he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. The small smiles he'd give when our eyes met across the room. And the quiet moments when I'd catch him looking at that silver pen, as though it held all his memories, all his regrets, all the little joys tucked away in the folds of his life. A few days later, he called me into his office again, but this time there was no sense of urgency. He had a relaxed air, leaning back in his chair with his hands folded over the pen, which he twirled absent-mindedly. "Martha," he said, "I've been thinking about that evening. You really went out of your way, and I appreciated it more than I can say." I smiled, brushing off the compliment, though my chest warmed at the sincerity in his tone. "It was nothing, really. Just dinner." He shook his head. "No, it wasn't nothing. It was a reminder of kindness, and patience, and connection. Sometimes we forget that life is made up of these small, quiet moments, and we let them slip away." I nodded, feeling a lump in my throat. There was something about the way he spoke, so reflective, so genuine, that made me want to absorb every word. It was like he was sharing a part of himself that he didn't often show. Over the next week, our interactions changed subtly. He stopped rushing through conversations. He asked for my opinions on things, really listened, and sometimes even lingered after meetings, talking about books he loved or trips he'd taken long ago. And I found myself noticing him in ways I hadn't before: the slight crinkle at the corner of his eyes when he smiled, the calm steadiness in his voice when he explained something thoughtfully. Then came the day he lost the pen again, not physically, but metaphorically. A major client meeting went wrong, and he came into my office looking flustered, hands trembling slightly as he tried to organize the papers in front of him. He had always been composed, even under pressure, so seeing him like that made my chest tighten. Without thinking, I placed a reassuring hand over his, a gentle gesture that surprised both of us. "It's okay," I said softly. "We'll fix it. Together." He looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment, the world outside the office didn't exist. There was gratitude, relief, and something deeper, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. He exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, and said, "You always know how to calm the storm, Martha." I felt the weight of those words settle over me. It wasn't about the pen, or the dinner, or even the work. It was about trust, about human connection, about showing up for someone in ways that mattered. Even quietly that evening, I found myself thinking about inviting him over again. Not because of obligation, but because I wanted to see him outside the confines of the office, to share a meal, a conversation, and the small intimacy of a quiet evening together. It felt natural, the kind of invitation that didn't need explanation or expectation. When I called, he agreed almost immediately, though his voice carried a hint of curiosity, the same kind of curiosity that had drawn me to him in the first place. We decided to cook together this time, turning the kitchen into a space of shared purpose, laughter, and small confessions. The evening was different from the first. We chopped vegetables side by side, swapped stories about childhood adventures, and debated over the perfect seasoning for a roast. There was laughter, light teasing, and moments of silence that weren't empty but full of understanding, recognition, and the simple joy of being in each other's company. At one point, as we set the table, he paused and looked around, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "You know," he said, "it's strange how much you can learn about someone just by spending a few hours in a kitchen together." I smiled, feeling the warmth of the candles and the oven light on my face. "It's the little moments," I said. "They tell you more than grand gestures ever could." He nodded, and for a long time, neither of us spoke. We simply ate, shared stories, and allowed the comfort of companionship to fill the room. By the time he left that night, I felt a subtle shift in the world around me. Something delicate and important had begun to grow: trust, understanding, and a deep appreciation for the quiet ways two people could connect. And I realized that these moments, fleeting as they might be, had a way of leaving footprints on the heart that lingered far longer than any physical trace. The days that followed carried a quiet rhythm, like the soft hum of a familiar song I hadn't realized I remembered. Mr. Dalton and I settled into a delicate pattern of interaction that was neither work nor personal, yet somehow intimate in its own subtle way. He still carried the weight of his responsibilities, but there was a softness now, a humanizing of the man behind the suit and the office door. One afternoon, as the autumn light slanted through the office windows, casting long golden streaks across the floor, he asked me if I could accompany him to a charity auction. At first, I hesitated. It was outside the usual boundaries of our professional life. But something in his tone, the quiet hopefulness, the almost boyish excitement, nudged me toward saying yes. The evening arrived, and we drove together through streets glowing under the gentle illumination of streetlights. There was an ease in our conversation, a flow of words and laughter that didn't feel forced. He talked about his late wife with a rare tenderness, remembering the small, vivid details of her life and their shared moments. I listened, quietly, feeling the depth of his grief and the lightness of his nostalgia mingling in the same space. At the auction, the atmosphere buzzed with polite conversation and the clinking of glasses. Yet we found ourselves in a quieter corner, talking as if the rest of the world didn't exist. He confessed that he had felt disconnected for a long time, that even success and recognition hadn't filled certain spaces in his life. I understood. I, too, had known emptiness in places others might never see. During a lull in the proceedings, he reached for my hand, not in any romantic gesture, but as a grounding touch, a reassurance in the midst of unfamiliar crowds. "Martha," he said quietly, "thank you for being here, for reminding me of what it feels like to connect with someone." I squeezed his hand gently, feeling a warmth that wasn't sudden or frantic, but steady and comforting. "Sometimes it just takes one person to remind us," I replied, "and I think we both needed it." The night carried on with quiet elegance. We watched the auctioneer's gavel come down, heard the soft applause, and shared a laugh over the extravagant items that seemed so distant from our lives. But it wasn't the auction that mattered. It was the shared glances, the easy conversation, the unspoken understanding that neither of us had anticipated finding in the other. Driving home, the streets lined with amber-hued trees, we fell into comfortable silence. I noticed how his hand occasionally brushed against mine, a gentle, almost accidental contact that spoke volumes without a word. And I realized that connection, real connection, could be quiet, patient, and unhurried, a thread weaving through ordinary moments, creating something unexpectedly profound. When we arrived, he lingered at the door, looking at me with an expression I could not fully interpret: gratitude, admiration, perhaps a hint of longing. "Martha," he said softly, "I hope we can do this again sometime." "I'd like that," I answered, though I knew it wasn't just about repeating the evening. It was about acknowledging that our lives, separate yet intertwined, had shifted in a way that neither of us could ignore. After he left, I sat by the window, the night stretching quiet and endless before me. I reflected on how subtly life could surprise you: a lost pen, a shared meal, a few hours spent in honest conversation, and how these small events could illuminate the heart in ways grand gestures never could. Days turned into weeks, and the bond between us deepened. We began to share more stories of our pasts, hopes for the future, and quiet reflections on our work. He confided in me about his fears, his regrets, and moments of joy that were tucked away in his memory. And I found myself reciprocating, revealing parts of myself I hadn't shared with anyone at work. One afternoon, we stayed late, going over reports together. The office was silent, save for the occasional tap of keys and the rustle of papers. I noticed him leaning back in his chair, tired but content, and I felt a pang of empathy. "You work too hard," I said lightly, though my tone carried genuine concern. He chuckled softly, but his eyes met mine with an unspoken understanding. "Maybe," he said, "but it's easier when someone else reminds me to pause." That simple sentence lingered. It was more than a comment on work, it was an acknowledgement of our shared presence, our ability to anchor each other in ways both comforting and transformative, and so our connection grew quietly, steadily, without fanfare. Each encounter, each shared story, each gentle gesture became a testament to the profound impact of human presence and empathy. I realized that the most unexpected relationships often bring the deepest sense of discovery, reminding us of the beauty in attentiveness, patience, and trust. By the end of that week, I understood that what had begun as a simple act of returning a lost pen had evolved into something far more meaningful. It was no longer about gratitude or obligation. It was about two people, finding solace, understanding, and quiet joy in one another's company, a connection that neither of us anticipated, but both of us quietly cherished. The weeks that followed settled into a comforting rhythm, one that felt surprisingly natural given the unusual beginning. Work remained busy, but the edges of the office no longer felt harsh or isolating. Mr. Dalton and I shared quiet exchanges, gentle nods, and small conversations that carried the weight of mutual respect and trust. There was a new depth to our interactions, something that had quietly taken root and grown in the spaces between routine and obligation. One evening, after a particularly long day of meetings and deadlines, he asked if I could help him organize some old files in his office. I agreed, sensing that this was more than just tidying papers, it was an invitation into his private world. As we sorted through folders, photographs, and letters, he shared stories about his past, moments of pride, mistakes he wished he could undo, memories of laughter, and the quiet sorrow of missed opportunities. I listened, offering gentle words and occasional laughter, my presence providing him a space to unburden himself. At one point, we paused over a photograph of him with his late wife. He traced the outline of her face with a finger, his eyes soft. "It's strange," he murmured, "how time can feel both fleeting and endless. I miss her every day, yet I realize that life keeps moving, whether we're ready or not." I felt a lump in my throat, but I smiled softly, understanding that he was sharing a part of himself few ever saw. "She would be proud," I said quietly, "of everything you've built, and the way you continue to care for those around you." He looked at me then, really looked, and I saw gratitude, vulnerability, and an unspoken connection that went far beyond words. It was a moment of recognition, two people acknowledging the beauty and fragility of life, and the quiet ways they could support each other through it. After the office work was done, he hesitated, then asked if I wanted to join him for dinner again. This time, there was no pretense, no need for explanation. It was simply two people sharing an evening, as equals, as companions. I agreed, and we spent the night cooking together, our conversation flowing effortlessly between past and present, dreams and regrets. There was a subtle shift that evening, a deepening of trust, an understanding that our bond had grown into something meaningful, even if it was difficult to define. We laughed, we shared stories, and we lingered over small details of our lives that often go unnoticed in the rush of daily routine. At one point, as we cleared the table, he paused and said softly, "Martha, I've realized something important. Life is too short to hold back gratitude, kindness, or connection. And tonight, I feel all of those things more than I have in years." I smiled, feeling the warmth of the moment. "Sometimes, it takes the smallest gestures to remind us of what truly matters," I replied. The night ended with a quiet walk outside, the cool air brushing against our faces. The city lights shimmered softly, and there was a stillness, a sense of shared understanding that didn't need words to convey its depth. We stood for a moment, simply taking in the calm, the presence of one another, and the comfort that comes from truly being seen. When he left, he paused at the door, looked at me with a gentle smile, and said, "Thank you, Martha. For the evenings, for your presence, and for reminding me that life's small moments can carry the greatest meaning." I watched him walk away, feeling a quiet peace settle over me. That night, I reflected on how a lost pen had brought us together not through obligation or chance, but through shared humanity, trust, and empathy. I realized that connection, real and meaningful, often begins in the most unexpected ways, and that it is nurtured by patience, kindness, and presence. As I sat by the window, gazing at the city lights, I understood that this experience had changed me. It had reminded me of the value of attention, the importance of listening, and the quiet power of being there for someone, even in the smallest of gestures. And I knew that, no matter what the future held, these moments of shared laughter, thoughtful conversation, and mutual respect would stay with me forever. In the end, it wasn't about the pen, the dinners, or the evenings we shared. It was about two people discovering the profound impact of presence, understanding, and the quiet, sustaining beauty of human connection. And that, I realized, was a gift far more precious than anything else life could offer. The memory lingers still, a reminder that unexpected kindness can transform lives, that empathy can create bonds, and that even the smallest gestures, when rooted in sincerity, can leave an imprint that lasts a lifetime.